Just before Robert Williams died, on a golden autumn afternoon, we had a seafood picnic in his yard in Baldwin, Michigan, out in the National Forest. And I predicted that there would be a Robert Williams monument in Monroe one day. I said, well, I think the old pool, they filled it in. I think it would be a good base for a statue.
Say that.
Piece of concrete that large.
Say that.
But he said, no. He said, let me tell you how these monuments work. Black woman's driving her little boy. They passed Jimmy Lee Jackson High School. He says, Mama, who's Jimmy Lee Jackson? Mom says, well, he was a black man that stood up for justice, but the white folks killed him. They take left on Martin Luther King Drive, said Robert. He said, little boy says, Mama, who was Martin Luther King? He said, well, son, he's a black man who stood up for justice, and the white folks killed him. Robert said, now, pretty soon that little boy starts to get the idea. He said, I'm fixing to die in bed, surrounded by my family, in our lovely cottage out here in the woods. So you start building monuments to a black man like me, that little fella might get the wrong idea. I want to thank Robert Heath and a few good men and the Winchester Alumni Association and the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission and all of you who brought to this great day when we mark our history and honor the legacy of Robert F. Williams. I want to congratulate all the young scholars who have won Robert F. Williams scholarships over the years. College is not high school part 2. Give yourself to it, it'll become your freedom highway. I hated high school. I couldn't believe when I got to college how great it was. I'm not talking about the friends and the fun and the freedom. I'm talking about the library and my classes. I also want to join with Jonathan and in commending Connie Williams' book, Audacity, which is she's a local teacher and writer, and it's well worth your time. She wanted very much to be here today. She lost her daughter not so long ago. So I wanted you to remember her and her family in your prayers too. Robert published Negroes with Guns, his book, in 1962, after he'd been compelled to leave Monroe in something of a hurry, and wrote it from exile in Cuba. I read Negroes with Guns in about 1990. I was in graduate school. I thought it was remarkable. I thought it was probably at least half true. But then I went over to the Governor Luther Hodges papers in Raleigh, and he had about a 3-foot thick file on Robert Williams. And I began to leaf through it, and I found newspaper clippings. And they were from the front page of the great newspapers of the world, the New York Times, the London Times, the paper in Tokyo, the paper in Dakar, the paper, you name it. It was just, and I thought, wait a minute, he was world famous.
International.
How come I'm a year into a PhD in American history and I've never heard of him? Not to mention growing up in North Carolina. You know, in the civil rights and black power era. Well, I've not heard his name. Well, the truth is, he didn't fit his life did not fit the standard narrative of civil rights, the sugar-coated confection fiction of civil rights that was prominent at that time.
Tell the truth.
And I found, too, that Negroes with Guns was not only scrupulously honest, but really a little understated. Robert was a local NAACP president after stints in the Army and the Marine Corps. He recruited a large and mostly working class NAACP branch, with a lot of young folks, and armed the branch and organized them to defend their community because of rampant Ku Klux Klan terrorism. The Klan used to come riding through, shooting up into people's windows, hooting and hollering with the dome lights on their car, with their hoods and robes, trying to terrify the black community. Now, Robert first reached international fame when two young black boys, 8 and 10 years old, were sentenced to reform school until they were 21 because they had been playing with some white children in a vacant lot, and on toward evening, a kissing game ensued. Somebody kissed somebody. And they were put in reform school. Robert understood the Cold War, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union for resources and power all over the globe. And he knew that if you could get things out in an international way, that it forced the hand of the United States government, because America's big problem in its international relations was our racial caste system here at home. We're trying to be the beacon of democracy in the world, and it's Robert called it beacon of democracy.
A big lie.
Anyway, he made this an international scandal, and young men were all of a sudden, Governor Hodges decided they'd been rehabilitated after about 3 months and let them out. Robert became an open advocate of what he called armed self-reliance among black folks because of Ku Klux Klan terror, and also because of no chance of a fair trial in court. Did not have access to police protection in the way that white citizens did. He said there's no 14th or 15th Amendment in this social jungle called Dixie. In 1960, Robert had a debate with Martin Luther King about nonviolence. Which, by the way, Robert did actually organize nonviolent direct action campaigns, sit-ins at the drugstore and such. He wasn't against nonviolence when it had a chance of working. But he also was not going to let them snatch away the lives of black people just for demanding their rights.
Tell the truth.
But if you read the debate, Martin Luther King concedes the necessity of armed self-defense. And I quote, "When the Negro uses force in self-defense, he does not forfeit respect. He may even win it by the courage and self-respect that it reflects." That is Martin Luther King in this debate. And then King goes on to say, to come out against sort of armed military action against white people, as if that was what Robert Williams had proposed, which he never proposed or practiced. But one of the things, when I came to research Robert Williams, I was interested in issues about violence and nonviolence, and then when you start looking, you can hardly find a civil rights activist who's not armed. Because it's one thing to practice nonviolence on Sunday afternoon with the TV camera running, but on Saturday night, don't run up in their house. Fannie Lou Hamer, they asked her how would she became a famous civil rights activist. How did she stay alive in Louisville, Mississippi? She said, because I had a loaded shotgun in every corner of my house.
Tell the truth.
Rosa Parks, in her autobiography, says that she admired Dr. King and that she thought that nonviolence had strategic strength in some ways, but she herself could not practice that, and that's why she always had guns to protect her family. That's Rosa Parks. It's in her autobiography. See, but we still carry a fiction in our head that, black possibility is human possibility. And people are not going to let you kill their children. They don't want, didn't become a military struggle in any way. But people defended themselves. And so, Robert, I think the main difference was he wouldn't shut up about it.
And he shouldn't.
And he did, because his advocacy of armed self-defense brought him into conflict with the civil rights establishment, as well as white folks. By the way, when, as Jonathan mentioned, Rosa Parks came and delivered a eulogy at Robert's funeral in 1996. And she said that those of us who marched with Martin Luther King in Alabama always admired Robert Williams for his courage and his commitment to freedom. The work he did should go down in history and never be forgotten. Now, as I said, Robert had to leave Monroe in sort of a hurry in 1961 and published Negroes with Guns the next year. It became a cult classic, and actually, Robert became the most important intellectual influence on the Black Panther Party. From Cuba, he continued to publish his newsletter, The Crusader, for as many as 40,000 subscribers. He had a radio show weekly from Radio Havana on Friday night that you could hear in Monroe and Los Angeles and Seattle and New York. His show was called Radio Free Dixie, and it broadcast news from the civil rights movement that the media wasn't carrying, and it played songs from the Black freedom struggle that the radio stations wouldn't play, Nina Simone, etc.
Yeah.
And I loved his wife, Mabel Williams, it's really, you can't talk about Robert Williams without understanding what a rock she was.
Say that, yeah.
For him. Not just brave, but brilliant. Anyway, she was sort of the announcer on Radio Free Dixie, and her voiceover every week was, "You are tuned to Radio Free Dixie from Havana, Cuba, where integration is an accomplished fact." And it's important, and I think both Jonathan and Yusuf give you this, but it's important to bear in mind that Robert was brave, but that his strength came from this community, from his roots. His grandparents, Sykes and Isabel Ellen Williams, both born in slavery. People don't understand how close this history was. Martin Luther King's grandmother had been enslaved. Robert's best friend growing up, his first political teacher, the root of Robert's radicalism was his grandmother.
Yes.
He also, on the other side, lived Ellen Bell Stitt, Mama Stitt, they called her, and who told about naming her mama, naming all of their children, all the girl children that she had. She made their middle name Bell, hoping that after, and they kept selling away her children, and she hoped that one day they would be able to find one another by their middle name somehow. But he grew up bringing in wood and water for those two women and hearing their stories of slavery and Reconstruction. His grandparents were activists in the fusion movement. The fusion movement in 9 of the 11 states of the former Confederacy, between 1865 and 1900, there were fusion movements. That is to say, black and white political formations, interracial political formations. Black Republicans, there are a lot of white Republicans too. When I say Republican, I mean Lincoln Republicans. They were, they were Republicans because of the Union. And then the populists were a break-off of the Democratic Party who were interested in the economic rights for poor folks. So they made an interracial coalition. In North Carolina, it took power. They won in 1894. They took the state legislature. In 1896, the rest of it, both U.S. Senate seats, they elected the governor. All this, this interracial coalition. A lot more African-American public officials in that day than in this. And in 1898 and 1900, white conservatives launched what they called the white supremacy campaigns that essentially overthrew the government of the state by force and by fraud.
Tell the truth.
At any rate, this was the story that his grandmother told him. And if you look at his politics, he didn't hate white folks. He didn't object to making common cause with white folks if they were interested in and capable of making common cause on an equal basis, mutual respect. That was good. Now, she also gave him, before she died, when he was a young teenager, she gave him the rifle, the ancient rifle that his grandfather protected them with at the turn of the century against the Klan mobs. Which, when Robert died, that was hanging over his desk where he was finishing off his memoirs. His grandfather was a crusading editor. He and his grandmother put out a paper called The People's Voice. Mm-hmm. And Robert grew up on his grandmother's stories of their activism and looking at that old iron printing press rusting out in the barn. And there was a room in the house where there were stacks and stacks. He had a full run of The People's Voice in the house. So this is where his radicalism really comes from. People accused him of being a communist, and he didn't mind working with anybody that was going the same way. But the FBI reported about him that Robert Williams has had a break with the Communist Party in Cuba because he continues to complain about their lack of employment for Afro-Cubans. The FBI also said of this community that Negroes in Monroe consider him a John Brown figure and will do anything for him. At the end of Robert's life, he began to show a really strange, almost mystical resemblance to Frederick Douglass. It seemed like every week he got looking more like Frederick Douglass. If you look at the last photographs, from that day we had picnic out in his yard, those photographs that were taken, he looks just like Frederick Douglass. And as we honor Robert Williams today, I'm reminded when I think of him of what the poet Edwin Markham wrote about Abraham Lincoln. But I think it works real nicely for Robert F. Williams. He held his place, held the long purpose like a growing tree, held on through blame and faltered not at praise. And when he fell in whirlwind, he went down as when a lordly cedar, green with boughs, goes down with a great shout upon the hills and leaves a lonesome place against the sky. And as young people see this marker and begin to learn about their history, yes, I do hope that a lot of them will get the wrong idea.